good afternoon. Good afternoon, Sweden. Woohoo! Yeah, I think it's my heartbeat is quite high now, so has to bring a little bit more energy. So before we get started, who attending my talk yesterday? Wow. Thank you so much for coming back. And hopefully we learned something about CSS today. I talked quickly to Robin, and he also wanted to learn a bit about CSS Grid. So let's see. 2016, what happened? I was building this carousel. And then it's not just any other carousel. It was the carousel building only using CSS. It's like, I know it sounds interesting, but you can understand all of this code. That's how you build it. 10 out of 10. Easy. Actually, I don't remember how I did it. It's just a bunch of hacks. Essentially, it worked, and then people seem to be interested on it, right? So I was posted it on CodePen. And you know, CodePen, it is not a social media. So you don't expect your CodePen to be viewed by almost 1 million people. When it did happen, and essentially, there's a lot of comment about like, man, I want it, right? Like, can you support like more picture? Is it like supporting autoplay because it's carousel? So I believe CSS is more powerful because just a bunch of hacks could have you build this kind of UI. So move forward for a few years. I was looking into this tutorial. Anyone before? Yeah, sure, awesome. Maybe you haven't seen, but for me, it is one of the most memorable. It's like 10 single line CSS layout. Essentially, you can achieve quite amazing layout using one line CSS. And then there's a link at the end, don't worry, if you don't manage to take photo. But essentially, like from simple thing as placing thing in center into something they call this constructed pancake. And then the setup simple. You had a flex container, and then you set a flex property on the children. And then just with that, you kind of achieve this amazing responsive layout as you shrinking the UI. Item is like shrink, and then grow, and then it's respond accordingly. No media query needed. That's the point. And then we had another one with CSS Grid. That's interesting, right? So in the same article, you have this ability to just set the CSS Grid, and then you can do grid template column with minmax. And then just with that, you can kind of achieve this layout. You can, it's like item shrink from a couple of item 3 to 2 to 1. One line of CSS. That is the kind of layout that we've been thinking for a long time, but it's not really possible before Grid. And that is really truly make it responsive. And I think that moment I was like, if CSS can do this kind of layout, what else could I have missed, right? So a bit forward, 2021, I built this open source project. I don't know why I built Spotify. I don't know if it's anything to do with Sweden, but it's happened. It was the Angular Spotify, so it's with Angular, so it's not React. Okay. And then I need to build this kind of grid. And then as you can imagine, this grid needs to be responsive. It has to be, changing, adapt based on the available space. And then all of the one line that I've seen before suddenly make a lot of sense, right? And yeah, sorry, I haven't rehearsed the talk for before I come to Sweden. So that is kind of the layout that I want, and it's working. It's just one layout, see that? And so that is 2025. No, 2022. Sorry, my mind was a bit not in sync. So that is the responsible form using Flex. In 2022, I saw this kind of tutorial. And then instead of setting any breakpoint, it's using purely Flex and then Flex rough so you can achieve the same kind of layout. It feels amazing, to be honest. And at 2025, that's why I'm here. I talked to a lot of developers. Apparently, not everyone knows about this all of this technique. So that's why I'm here today, talk about the magic you might have been missing CSS. And the agenda in the next half an hour, we are looking to only 3 things. The first thing is very basic. We start with Flex, right? Flex graph, and then we go with Grid, the power pattern that you might have been missing. And lastly, we might have some time for some of the new stuff. Could be container query, could be hash. And yeah, before we get started, I will do a quick introduction. I'm Trung. My name is not here, but it's this one. I'm the Google developer expert in Angular. That's why you see that I do quite a number of things with Angular. And then I am also a Google developer expert in web technology. And I do speak at conference about modern web development technique, mainly on making the web fast and delightful for the user. So this one, you've seen it yesterday, it's the same slide. I come from Vietnam. I live in Singapore in the past 10 years, and I took quite a long flight to Sweden. 14 hours, that's a direct flight. That's why you can feel from my voice today. Now the jet lag is really kicked in. I had like 5 hours sleep last night. So that's Singapore, you've never been. We had the waterfall indoor, the Jewel. Then you had Marina Bay Sands, had Garden by the Bay. It is a small country, but it's incredibly modern and green. So come and visit Singapore in the future. You have been. And as I promised, before I come here, I actually had a bit of test at home. A bit of Sweden test at home. You can guess. I went to IKEA Singapore last week just to take some photo to show you guys today. That's the commitment that I had. Yeah, I had a bit of taste of Sweden before I come. So yeah, that's the point. And I'm with Ascenda. We're building like loyalty program for banking and financial services around the world. So let's warm up with Flex. I think now I get the rhythm already, so kind of feel it. That is the easier thing that you can use to kind of preventing layout from breaking. As simple as that, using Flex graph, and we look into it. So imagine you had this kind of layout, and then right, you had a short text and you had a link, and then possibly you had a longer text. And what you wanted to achieve is like when the text is long, like listed article in text on the right side, you don't want the layout to be break. You want the button to kind of flow nicely into the next line. And it is a small detail. And what Flexbox help you to achieve. And then that's how it should look like in the real application, right? This from my application, it's not the real Spotify, just so you know. And the setup, again, all of my slides, a lot of code. So if you've seen it yesterday, you kind of get it. So we had a div, and we had a heading. And then next to the heading, you had a link, simply. And then as you can see, the flow is like top to bottom, because this is display block. That's the default behavior. And you put in Flex. And then you put in Flex, it's kind of putting the two things next to each other. It's like kind of forced into the same slide. That is a default behavior of Flex. And then there's no space in between. So I put in a little bit of space. Right? I put in space between. So there's a bit of breathing room between them. And as you can see, yeah, there's some spaces. And then as you kind of adding more content, both of the item, I'm not sure if it's clear enough, but the space between them is very little. So essentially, you cannot really render them in the same line. That's why it kind of wrap a bit awkwardly into like two items is wrapping into the line, which might not be what we want. And as you can see, you don't even have enough space to render the whole heading anymore. So that's why it's wrapping nicely to the next line. Same for the button. And now we put in Flex graph. Yeah, we put Flex graph. And just with that, it's kind of instantly making the layout a little bit more resilient. Right? It's might be what we want, might not be what you want, but in a lot of use cases, it have. And now, like you think about it, it's just one life. See, that's Flex graph. But 10 years ago, we tried to do a lot of different techniques, like display table, float, and then position absolute. Nothing worked as what we want. only when flex rough and then like display flex come in 2015. And yeah, that's the point. I mean, now looking back, this look easy because now looking backward, but actually it's not like super straightforward before. And as you can see, like with flex rough, you can kind of make a resilient layout. However, it feel a bit random. Like you don't have a very like well control out of it. That's where flex basic come in. So it's gonna give you the control that you want. And so we look into the flex property. That's like three things. If you remember, like grow, shrink, and basis. And how many of you use flex basis? Maybe 10%. Yeah, this is not the most popular property, I believe. So in this case, I set on 100 pixel, and it essentially say, start at 100 pixel, but I allow you to grow, and I also allow you to shrink as much as you want. And flex basis is like, it is gonna define the initial sizes that an item should have. And in this case, yeah, that's what I just say. So we are gonna look into the form that we say just now at the beginning. So you had this kind of responsive form, right? You are shrinking the form, no media query, but then the item is kind of wrapping and you are shrinking the size of the container. And that is the magic when you pair flex rough and flex basis. And I think the code, I know it is super complicated, but you don't really have to pay too much attention to HTML. That is one HTML container, and then you have 3 children inside. That is the baseline. And you put in flex for the parent, so that it is forcing into the same line. And then here, the interesting thing is we had 3 numbers. We had 160, we had 220, and you had 80. So this goes there for a reason. Essentially, if you add them up, it will become a big number. And then because you had 3 flex children, you need to calculate with some gap in between them. So like 3 children next to each other, there's 2 gaps. I know there's a lot of imagination in your head. But at the end, we get into this 492. And then at exactly 492, everything looks nice. It can be fit in a single line. That's the math. But if you essentially just a little bit smaller, the container is just a little bit smaller. Let's say 491. Then, now the button is kind of wrapping to the next line. Because the 2 text box that we had before, like we do the math again, right? It's a lot of calculation, I know. But essentially, when you do a math again, it's coming to a smaller number, like 396. And then with that number, it is smaller than the 491. And then because of that, the 2 text box can be put into next to each other, into a single kind of row on top. And that is just some math involved. And then you can see all of the code just now I show you one more time back to the previous slide. That is all of the code to make this responsive form work. That's it. There's a flex container. You set the flex property for each of the children, and then the sizes that you want as the flex basis. So let's just work. Let me go to the next one. So there's a 4 variant, right? So I show you just now. Maybe it's not very clear. So here, the first one, there's 3 things next to each other in one row. The second one, which is 2 items, and then the button into the next line. Next, we had 1 text box and 1 text box and button into the next line. And lastly, you had individual item into a kind of a next line, right? So again, that is super simple. But now you might have a question. And then a lot of people ask this question. What's the difference between flex basis and width? And of course, that is a normal question. And in a lot of use cases, in a default scenario, when the flex direction is row, then it will behave as width. Like flex basis is going to behave as width. Nothing more than that. But if it is a column direction, then it is behave like height. So it's not fixed at a width. That is the important detail. There's a bit more like nuances into how flex basis work, but that is what you should kind of remember from it. And I think it's beyond today talk to go into. So we look into the next one, the deconstructed pancake we looked before. And then in this case, I think I just show you this, the property again. We look into the code and we look into the behavior so that you kind of remember. Is it? No, sorry. Was that? Something is wrong. So something, yeah, I press it doesn't play. Yeah, just to replay the video again. And then here's the markup, right? We had 3 children, so we had a div, we had a parent, we have 3 children inside. And then you set them something is not super important. And essentially, you're gonna have 3 children, top to bottom. Because it's the default behavior, that's a display block. Nothing fancy. Then you're gonna put in flex, and as you put in flex, now you can see that 3 children put like being forced into the same lines as we've seen before. That's default behavior. That is flex 101. But maybe you haven't seen it yet, so I just make it slowly again. I take out flex. It is top to bottom again, and then I put in flex. This is like 5-second animation, very slow. And then I put in this flex property that we saw before. And then it is essentially say, don't grow, but you are allowed to shrink and start at 100 pixels. So if your container having enough space to fit in 3 items, and then we do the math again. I don't put in the math, but essentially there's 100 pixels times 3. There's some gap in between. If the container is satisfy this condition, then you can put 3 things into the same row. But as you kind of put in flex rough, and then you shrink it a little bit further, we see the same layout that we saw just now with the responsive form. So the item would be floating nicely into the next line. So that is essentially what it is. And for support in flex, it's been there for a very long time. Like 2015 was like 10 years, which means you can save to use. I think most of us using flex on production use anyway. So you can kind of like take advantage of flex rough and flex basic. And what if you want to have the control on both row and column? I think that's where CSS Grid come in. And we go into the next section. Right, so no one actually kind of believe it, but Grid is kind of underutilized. So there's like less than 40% of the website is using CSS Grid. This is coming from the metric from Chrome status. So it might not be the most reliable data that we can rely on. But essentially what it is trying to say is like very little website is utilizing Grid. And as you look into like the CSS survey, and then is your top CSS pain point, you can see Grid is always the top one. It is top for a couple of years. Because people mention Grid is undeniably powerful, but the learning curve is so steep. How many of you using Grid today? I think about 40%. So yeah, let's just look into Grid in the next 10 minutes. I think I still have enough time. So let's make the pace a little bit faster. So we had a, like 1 parent, 2 children. We're gonna have a Grid container. You want to define like 3 column track, and you're using template column. 3 things next to each other, 3 column. And as you only had 2 children, and you have a 3 column kind of template, what's gonna happen? This is going to be put into the first 2 columns. As simple as that. And that's it. That's all about Flex, really. It's the ability for you to placing things into the Grid. And we are going to look into it in a short while. But essentially, for a very long time, you've been to like Bootstrap era, we always wanted to build this kind of Grid. Like you always wanted to have this 12-column Grid. And then we've been trying to recreating it with float and then flex. So let's just look into the way we used to do it before. You put in a I'm not sure if it's clear. At the end, can you see it, the code? Yeah, sure. Right. So we had a container, we call it row, and you put in a flag, say simple, you put in flag wrap, and then with that, you're gonna have this kind of container, and then you're gonna put in a bunch of children inside, right? And then in order to make the grid work for multiple columns using flag, you need to do one thing. You need to set the flag property that we just in, so that you can fit into one parent, like 2 columns. So we set it as like 50% width, which means 100% divided by 50 is like 2, at 2 columns. Essentially, and that's how it looks like on the UI. Nothing more than that. And if you say, I want for the bigger screen, increasing it to 3 columns. So it's kind of defining this weird like syntax. You've never been to the bootstrap era, I might not go into. But essentially what it's trying to say is like, as the width growing, set the children size smaller so that I can fit more column into one container. And then that's how it looks like, right? So if you had enough space, then it can put in like 3 columns. And then what about now? So we are gonna use grid in most of these cases now. So I'm gonna show you again, that is how the app look like. I had a grid of like 3 columns. And then I'm gonna have this setup. And of course, no one was like, copy and paste the item. So you need to render the item using a loop. And in this case, that is finally Angular syntax. And then I had a container, I didn't put in anything. As you can notice, it's rendered as usual from top to bottom. There's nothing happened. And if I put in display grid, nothing happened. Yeah, that's it. Like you put in display grid, it doesn't change any behavior at all. Unless I say, I want to have some gap between them. Then now you start to see the behavior kind of changing a little bit. But the real power when you defining the template, right? You defining the track. So here I say, I want to have 2 column grid in this size. So that's how it look like. And then similarly, as what we've seen before, when my width is a little bit bigger, I want to have small column. So in this case, I had 3 columns. And then you can imagine, it's kind of you are setting a fixed number of columns for the fixed breakpoint. That is the simple approach that we have been using so far. And if you wanted to have more column when the screen is bigger, define a different template for the different breakpoint. 4, 5, 6, and so on. But it might not make a lot of sense, right? Because there might be some way that you will be possibly doing something like we've seen with Flex before. But before we get into it, let's just review how we do the whole thing again. So I had a container, I had some children inside. Flex and Grid, we put into the parent. So there's no difference. But the real difference is like, for the old approach, you want to set the size for the children. You size the children. But for the newer approach using grid, you was kind of saying, I define the track on the parent. So the result might look the same, but the way you are styling things is different. That is the key takeaway, and that's important for us to make into the next section. Couldn't be more simple. But as it's like fixed number of item win break when the other UI element change. So in this case, I had a resignable navbar, which is quite a common UI approach that we're building. And as you can see, as I shrink the container, nothing happened because it was relying on the breakpoint. So it's always keep it as 3 columns, which might not be the ideal scenario that we want. It sounds good in practice. It doesn't work in practice. It sounds good in theory. And so we look into the code again, right? So there's so much code for you to really defining a grid that work on a different screen size. And actually, there's an easier way to do it. It's called grid template column, the same thing. But now, you don't do repeat a fixed number of column anymore. You do some special syntax. It's called auto something. There's two value. We look into auto fill first. But essentially, there's the minmax that is more important. So it's, say, one children is going to be having at least 200 pixel width. And then if you have more space, maybe you can expand to fit in that space. And then auto, it just kind of instruct grid to say, can you just create as many columns as you can? So it is not deciding by you anymore, based on the screen size. It is redeciding by the grid container itself. And then to make things simple, we call it AIM, RAM. And just using one simple line of code, as I expanding the container, it work like before. Right. 4, I just want to see it like 3 to 4, please, yes, 3 to 4. And if you resize the navbar, it also work. Right. It's shrinking from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, depending on the container, on the parent sizes, depending on the container level. So it's work. That's important. Like grid is gonna reflow to whatever space remain. And then we just talk about this two property. And it is auto fill, that's what we've seen, and auto fit. And auto fill essentially say, if you had space for 5 items, but you only had 4 items on the UI, then you keep the last one empty. And then I just show you from the app, so that is easier. As you can see on the top, it's like auto fill. Bottom is auto fit. It really had an empty space at the end. It can fit in one, but it didn't do it because that's how the algorithm working. But if you wanted to fill this thing in, then you put in auto fit, right? So you had 4 items, and now it's kind of expanding to fill in the space from the last item. So each item is going to be a bit bigger, a bit larger. And then we see it again. But there's one differences, and I just want to show you. But let's say if you are using auto fit, you have the space for 5, and you had only 2 items, which means it's going to grow so big, as you can see on the UI. Right? It is so big. So sometimes we might want to use autofill to keep our layout consistent. But in maybe in different scenario, you might use autofit. That work as well. So again, that is the grid, and essentially the whole takeaway from the section is like, you don't need to set how many columns you need. Grid will decide for you. And then it's gonna work when the container change. So it's not depending on the screen size level anymore. Last thing, this one is gonna make grid undeniably powerful, which is grid template area. And again, how many people using? Yes. Yeah, that's what I want to see. Yes. Isn't a lot of people using grid template area. And that is the ability for you to placing things in a different place on grid. So we look into the same example again. You had 2 children, there's like 2 div. You had grid, you had defining it as 3 columns. And that's what we had. We had 3 columns. The first 2 on the first 2 columns, simple. Then let's say I wanted to let my first column to expand. I'm not sure if you've seen this syntax before. You do grid column 1 and then /3. What does it mean? You've never seen it before. It might not make sense, but essentially mean if you have a grid of 3 columns, you are going to have this 4 line on top of the 3. I'm not sure if it's clear enough. Right. So there's like 4 line on top. So you say, I want my children start from 1 and end at 3, which means it is going to expand for the next 2 columns. And so now you put in the template row is where it is interesting. So I put in like, there's 3 columns and 2 rows, which means now I had 2 rows. And I gonna say, okay, I want my second to be, now it's like, it's really need to put in places. So column 3 out of 4, which means at the end here, right, 3/4, and then I want it to be on the row number 2. But as we can see, when you read the code, and I can kind of see from your expression, it is not super intuitive. It requires a lot of like brain power to really compute things on your head. And so that is where grid template area come into place. So we look into one concrete example. Here I had a UI, so you can see I had a nav bar, I had a main container, and I had kind of a footer. And if I dim everything, so I think now is kind of clearer for you, right? So nav, main, and footer, simple. Then that's usually I'm gonna do it. I had the first div gonna fit in the nav bar and the main, and then I'm gonna have a footer at the end. It is very like normal way for us to approach this kind of layout. But if you wanted to put them into the same div, like you only had one parent, how is it even possible? Like, you think about it for a moment. It is only possible if you're using CSS Grid. That's the short answer. You can't achieve the layout that we've seen before using Flex in this scenario. You wanted to have a single parent that controls everything. That is where Grid shine, right, essentially. And then, as you can see, that is the real, like, taking from the real app. So it's kind of dividing into 4 like area on the UI. So it's like 2 column, 2 row. With me? All good? And then you can see from the code, it is really like there's only one div that controls everything. So that's the top one, there's a layout. And if you look downward, there's a nav bar. Yeah, sure, there's main view. And there's the now playing bar, which is the footer that we looked into just now. And that's how the code looks like. Impressive. If you've never seen this syntax, it looks quite intuitive for me personally. I'm not sure if it's for you, but for me. Because as I read it, I can kind of see that nav and main in the same line. And bottom is the whole footer. How it makes sense? And then the way for us to kind of construct it is you put in this template area, you're gonna have 3 children. And then each of the children is gonna define something called grid area. And then that is the name that you've seen before, right? So essentially, in this case, it is gonna map from the HTML element into this grid layout that we've seen previously. So here is like, okay, nav has a nav, main is main, and then footer is bar. And then everything was controlled by the boss, by the parent. That's my drawing using PowerPoint, by the way. So what is the benefit of all that? Essentially, that is what we've seen before, right? So there is nav, there's main, and there's bar at the end. And you can see it's bar. That's why you had a single thing at the end. But what if you want things to be a bit different? You want nav to stretch all the way from top to bottom. And then now one main and bar is on one side. Which means you change one line CSS and you get the result. You don't need to change the DOM structure at all. That is a power. That's a highlight. And of course, if you want to do like a bit, actually I didn't try it because my nav is really long, right? But essentially you can kind of achieve the layout that you want with a single line of CSS. And then, again, I show you how it looks like on the UI, so that is kind of clearer. That is 2 examples. It might not be super clear, but I dim the main part. So left side, nav and nav, you can kind of see the difference. Nav on the left, nav on the right. On the right is all the way. And then now we see the footer. Left side footer is stretching from all the way left to right, but on the right, it was only in that main area because it relies on your template area that we define. So there's a lot of like powerful things that you can do, but as you defining the grid template area, there is only one thing to take note of. And it has to be in this kind of rectangle shape. Otherwise, it doesn't work, right? In this case, you can see there's sidebar and sidebar. It's forming a rectangle. It's working. Maybe you had a header and header on top, then it's also working. But you had header and header, and you had header somewhere, then it will not work. It just doesn't form the shape that we wanted. And then the algorithm just couldn't really calculate and then render it on the UI. And then again, that is the whole section about grid. But it had been a solid support in own browser for a long time, 2017. Just 2 years after Flex. And I still was like intrigued by the amount of like website was using grid. Maybe because it is a bit more complicated. It is complicated. But if you understand it and you start to use it, it does help you to create a lot of powerful layout. One example, that's like printing music with CSS Grid. I'm not sure you've seen it before. That can help you to render something on the right side. And then, as you look into the code, it looks a bit scary. We will not look into the code in detail, but there's another example. This example is actually not about the photo. Yeah, it's not a point. It's not a point. The point is the whole post layout was done using CSS Grid. That is from ThreadUp. Right? You can do thread.com from Facebook when they're replacing Twitter. It's not replacing, but like when they launch for Twitter alternative. So this one was really the views using CSS Grid was like, wow. Maybe that is a use case that we don't really encounter. That's why we just never thought about this approach before. So again, I hope you see the powerful grid template area. And then today we look into 2 things, and I only had 2 minutes left. So we had auto column, which is repeat with something, min-max, and we had grid template area. And then, of course, I don't have time for the next section, but the next thing is like container query, and I go really fast. Essentially, you know media query, it is going to react to the screen size. And container query, on the other hand, it's kind of react to this simple space that you can see. It's reacting to the containing element. So some use case is that you had this card, and then when there's a grid, you wanted to display in this layout, and then when there's only one, you wanted to change the orientation. And you can use it with container query. So maybe I show you the example before we end. So it's kind of you shrinking, like you growing the container, then the card was displayed differently. And then as you are using the same component everywhere, you can kind of see the different variant that you could create with container query. And then we look into that is the last example we look into. So that is like, there's a grid. And then there's also another div. And that is using the exact same component. There's no additional instruction that you need to do. It's purely being done using like container query. You had a children that can react it to a surrounding element. And I think, yeah, we do not have time to go through all of them. And then container cannot go to the demo. Some of the examples you might see, I'm going to include in the end. We have like newsletter. You can see like that's the same component being rendered differently using like in a different context on the UI. And that's a big deal. And this one we skip today. And yes, we are here, right? So it was 9 years since 2016 when I building this CSS carousel only. And now it's like 2025. It is there in the, like, supported on the browser. It was crazy. Like, we can kind of see how much CSS has been growing up. And you might not be able to remember all of the property. But the only thing you should remember, CSS has grown up a lot. And there might be a different way to approach something. And so in this talk, we look into three things. The underrated trick with Flex. There's the powerful pattern using CSS Grid. And then the new stuff that we didn't have time to go through. But after today, I hope you kind of bring back some of this learning back to your work. And maybe you have this moment where you was like, oh, CSS was pretty amazing. And with that, thank you so much. Tak. I'll take a photo with everyone before you are going. Wow, it's very hard. I don't want to meet anyone, but yes, thanks so much. There's some, like, on the first two row, and then there's my book if you want to write something. But once again, thank you so much.